The phone call that saved my life came from a woman I had never met. "Mrs. Vivian Sanders," the voice asked gently. "My name is Helen Parker. I'm the director of Maple Grove Senior Living. Before we process your admission, I need to ask, did you personally sign these documents? I nearly dropped my coffee." "My admission," I whispered. According to the paperwork in front of her, I had been declared mentally unfit and scheduled to move into their facility within days. The person who submitted the documents was my own grandson, Brandon Miller. But the worst part wasn't the document. It was realizing someone had signed my name. If this story touches your heart, please take a moment to like and subscribe. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, what would you do if a family member betrayed your trust like this? I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. My name is Vivian Sanders. I am 72 years old, and until the morning that phone call arrived, I believed I understood exactly who I could trust. Looking back now, I realize that betrayal rarely arrives like a thunderstorm. It arrives quietly. It sits at your dinner table. It smiles for family photographs. And sometimes it calls you grandma. For 8 years, I had lived alone in the house my husband and I bought shortly after our wedding. The little white colonial home sat on a peaceful street outside Columbus, Ohio. Every corner of that house carried a memory. The oak tree in the front yard was planted by my husband Ethan the year our daughter Carol was born. The sunroom held dozens of photographs from family vacations. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon because Ethan had loved homemade apple pie. After he passed away from a heart attack, many people worried I wouldn't be able to manage by myself. But I did. I learned how to handle the bills. I maintained the garden. I volunteered twice a week at church. I met friends for coffee. I stayed active. Most importantly, I remained independent. I was proud of that. At my age, independence becomes something precious, something you protect, something you fight for. Back then, I never imagined someone I loved would try to take it away. My daughter Carol lived about 40 minutes away. We weren't extremely close, but we spoke regularly. She was busy with her small event planning business and had always been somewhat focused on work. Still, she called on holidays. She visited occasionally. We maintained a relationship. But the center of my world was my grandson, Brandon Miller. At least that's what I thought. When Brandon was little, he practically lived at my house. Carol had become a single mother shortly after his birth. Money was tight. Work schedules were difficult. So Ethan and I stepped in. We babysat. We attended school plays. We helped with homework. We packed lunches. We dried tears after nightmares. Brandon wasn't just my grandson. In many ways, he felt like another son. I still remember him at age 7 sitting at my kitchen table with chocolate milk on his upper lip. "Grandma," he once said, "when I grow up, I'm buying the house next door so I can stay close to you forever." I laughed and kissed the top of his head. Children say beautiful things, and grandparents remember them. As Brandon grew older, our bond remained strong. When he graduated high school, Ethan and I helped pay for college. When Ethan died, Brandon was one of the first people to arrive. He sat beside me through the funeral, held my hand, told me I wasn't alone. For years afterward, he visited every Sunday. We watched football, shared meals, talked about life. If someone had told me then that Brandon would eventually become the source of the greatest pain I had ever experienced, I would have called them crazy. But people change, sometimes slowly, sometimes so gradually that you don't notice until they're already someone else. The first major change happened after the pandemic. Brandon lost his job with a logistics company. At first, everyone sympathized. Jobs were disappearing everywhere. He assured me he would find something quickly. Months passed, then more months. The confident young man I knew became increasingly frustrated, angry, restless. His visits changed. Instead of laughing and telling stories, he spent hours complaining about employers, about the economy, about unfair opportunities, about other people's success. One afternoon, while we were drinking coffee on my porch, he asked a question that caught me off guard. "Grandma, have you ever thought about selling this place?" I looked around. The flower beds were blooming. The porch swing rocked gently in the breeze. "This house?" I asked. "Of course not." He shrugged. "It's probably worth a fortune." I laughed. "It isn't a fortune. It's my home." He smiled, but something about that smile felt strange. Forced. Calculated. The feeling disappeared quickly and I dismissed it. I wish I hadn't. Over the next year, similar questions appeared more often. How much was the house worth? Did I have a will? Who would inherit my savings? Had I considered moving somewhere smaller? At first, I assumed he was simply concerned about my future. Many families discuss those things. There was nothing unusual about it. Or so I believed. Then Brandon started talking about aging. Constantly. "Grandma, you need to be careful. Grandma, older people can get confused. Grandma, accidents happen. Grandma, memory problems can sneak up on anyone." The comments seemed innocent enough, but eventually they became repetitive, almost rehearsed. One Sunday afternoon, he watched me search for my reading glasses. They were sitting on the kitchen counter. I simply hadn't noticed them. Most people would have laughed. Brandon didn't. He stared at me. "You forgot where they were already," I chuckled. "Everyone loses their glasses." His expression remained serious. "I don't know, Grandma. That's how these things start." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. For the first time, I felt uncomfortable. Not afraid, not suspicious, just uncomfortable. A few weeks later, I mentioned the conversation to my friend Susan. She frowned. "That sounds odd." "What does?" "The way he keeps talking about your memory." I immediately defended him. "He's just worried." Susan nodded politely, but she didn't look convinced. Neither was I. Not completely. Still, Brandon remained my grandson, the boy I had helped raise, the young man who had stood beside me at Ethan's funeral. I trusted him. Trust can be a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. Around that same time, Brandon's financial situation appeared to worsen. He stopped talking about job interviews. He seemed stressed, distracted. Sometimes he arrived looking exhausted. I offered help more than once. Money, contacts, advice. He always declined, or at least he pretended to. Then one evening, as he was leaving my house, he paused near the front door. His eyes lingered on the framed family photos covering the hallway wall. "You're lucky, Grandma." "How so?" I asked. "You've built something valuable." I smiled. "My family." His gaze shifted toward the living room, toward the house itself, toward everything Ethan and I had spent decades creating. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Something like that." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. A few months later, my phone rang. A woman named Helen Parker introduced herself as the director of Maple Grove Senior Living. And within minutes, everything I thought I knew about my family began to collapse. After I ended the call with Helen Parker, I sat alone in my kitchen for nearly an hour. The coffee in front of me had gone cold. Outside, birds continued singing as if nothing had happened. Inside, my entire world felt different. One question repeated itself over and over in my mind. Why? Why would Brandon do something like this? The answer didn't come immediately. Instead, memories began surfacing. Little moments, small conversations, tiny details I had dismissed at the time, details that suddenly looked very different. Looking back now, I realized the warning signs had been there all along. I simply hadn't wanted to see them. The first strange incident happened almost a year before Helen's phone call. I had been expecting a statement from my bank. The envelope never arrived. At first, I assumed the mail service had made a mistake. It happens. A few days later, I called the bank and requested another copy. The representative seemed confused. "Mrs. Sanders, according to our records, the statement was delivered." I shrugged it off. No point worrying over one missing envelope. Then it happened again. And again. Not every month. Just often enough to feel unusual. Several pieces of financial mail disappeared. Tax notices, investment summaries, property assessment documents. Sometimes they arrived already opened. That bothered me. I lived alone. No one should have been opening my mail. One afternoon, I mentioned it to Brandon while he was helping me carry groceries into the house. "Someone keeps opening my letters." He immediately stopped walking. "What kind of letters?" The question came too quickly, too eagerly. "Mostly bank paperwork." His expression changed for just a second. Then he smiled. "Maybe you're opening them and forgetting." I laughed. "No, I'm not." He laughed too, but something about his reaction felt strange. At the time, I couldn't explain why. Now I can, because he wasn't surprised. He was gathering information. A few weeks later, another incident occurred. I logged into my online banking account and noticed 3 failed login attempts. The bank's security system had temporarily locked access. The representative asked if I had forgotten my password. I hadn't. I used the same secure password for years. Someone else had clearly tried to access the account. Again, I mentioned it casually to Brandon. Again, his reaction felt wrong. Instead of concern, he became curious. What account was it? How much money was in it? Did the bank say where the login attempts came from? The questions came one after another. Far more questions than answers. When I told him I didn't know, he seemed disappointed. At the time, I interpreted that disappointment as concern. Today I know better. Around the same period, Brandon began showing unusual interest in my paperwork. Every visit seemed to include financial questions. He asked about my insurance policies, my retirement accounts, my will, the deed to my home. One Sunday afternoon, he sat at my kitchen table studying a folder while I prepared lunch. "What are you looking at?" I asked. He held up a document. "The house deed." My stomach tightened. "Why?" He shrugged. "Just curious?" I took the document from his hands. For a brief moment, irritation flashed across his face. Then it disappeared. The smile returned. But I had seen it, and for the first time, a small seed of concern took root inside me. Not fear. Not yet. Just concern. A few months later, my daughter Carol started making similar comments. That surprised me, because Carol had never shown much interest in my finances before. Then suddenly she did. One evening she called while I was watching television. "Mom, have you ever considered moving somewhere with more support?" I frowned. "What do you mean? A retirement community?" I laughed. "I'm perfectly fine where I am." There was a pause. Then she said something that bothered me. "Brandon worries about you." The words immediately caught my attention. "Why?" "He says you're becoming forgetful." I sat up straighter. "Forgetful? Nothing serious." "Carol, I forgot where I left my glasses once. I'm just telling you what Brandon mentioned." The conversation ended shortly afterward, but the discomfort remained, because Brandon wasn't simply worrying. He was creating a narrative, a story, one that painted me as vulnerable, confused, unable to manage my own life. And apparently he wasn't telling that story only to me. He was telling it to others. The realization hurt. Still, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Grandmothers are good at that, sometimes too good. Several weeks later, I attended a church fundraiser. A woman I barely knew approached me afterward. "Vivian, how are you feeling these days?" I smiled. "Just fine." She hesitated. "I heard you've been having memory issues." My heart skipped. "What?" Her eyes widened. "Oh, maybe I misunderstood." But she hadn't misunderstood. Someone had told her. And I already knew who. That evening I sat alone in my living room thinking about the conversation. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Brandon wasn't simply expressing concern. He was planting ideas. Carefully, repeatedly, almost strategically. The following month brought another troubling discovery. I returned home from lunch with friends and found my office drawer slightly open. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing appeared stolen. Yet I knew I had left it closed. Inside that drawer were important documents: insurance papers, property records, financial statements, personal information. Everything remained there. But something felt wrong. I couldn't prove anyone had touched them. Still, the feeling refused to disappear. A few days later, Brandon stopped by unexpectedly. As we sat in the kitchen, he casually asked where I kept my important paperwork. The question hit me like a cold splash of water. I stared at him. "What an odd thing to ask." He laughed. "I was just thinking about emergencies." I didn't answer. For the first time, I noticed something in his eyes. Calculation. Not concern. Calculation. That night I barely slept. Yet even then, I couldn't imagine the truth. I couldn't imagine my own grandson actively preparing to take control of my life. The idea seemed impossible. Until another conversation changed everything. A month before Helen's phone call, Brandon came over for dinner. He appeared unusually cheerful, almost excited. We finished eating and moved into the living room. Then he asked a question that sent chills through me. "Grandma, have you ever thought about giving someone power of attorney?" I looked at him carefully. "Why would I do that?" "In case something happens." "I'm healthy. Things can change quickly." The room suddenly felt smaller. I remembered all the previous comments. The missing mail, the questions, the rumors, the discussions about memory loss, the interest in my finances. For the first time, genuine suspicion entered my mind. Not enough to accuse him, but enough to worry me. "I'll make those decisions if I ever need to." His smile disappeared, only briefly, but I noticed. Then he stood up. "Knew you'd say that." The words sounded harmless, yet something about them unsettled me, as if he had expected resistance, as if he had been working toward a goal, as if he already had a plan. A few weeks later, Helen Parker called, and suddenly every strange incident, every missing letter, every uncomfortable conversation, every rumor, every question about my money, every discussion about my memory, all of it fit together like pieces of a puzzle. The terrifying truth was beginning to emerge. Someone had been building a case against me, and the person leading that effort wasn't a stranger. It was the grandson I had loved like my own child. What I still didn't know was how far Brandon had gone, or how much he stood to gain if his plan succeeded. Those answers were waiting for me at Maple Grove Senior Living, and they would be even worse than I imagined. The morning after Helen Parker called me, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brandon's face. Not the face of the man he had become. The face of the little boy who used to run through my backyard chasing fireflies. The boy who cried when Ethan taught him how to ride a bicycle. The boy who once promised he would always protect me. I kept asking myself the same question. Had that little boy ever really disappeared? Or had I simply failed to see who he was becoming? By 9 o'clock the next morning, I was driving toward Maple Grove Senior Living. Helen had specifically asked me not to tell Brandon about our meeting. That request alone frightened me. If she believed the situation was serious enough to require secrecy, then I was walking into something far worse than a simple misunderstanding. Maple Grove sat on the outskirts of Columbus. The facility itself was beautiful. Fresh landscaping, clean buildings, residents walking peacefully through the gardens. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would fear. But as I parked my car, a knot tightened in my stomach. Because I wasn't there as a visitor. According to the document someone had submitted, I was supposed to become a resident. Without my knowledge, without my consent, without my signature. Helen Parker greeted me personally at the front entrance. She was a dignified woman in her early 60s, with silver blonde hair and kind eyes, the kind of person who immediately made you feel safe. "Mrs. Sanders. Please call me Vivian." She smiled warmly. "Then I'm Helen." We shook hands. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked directly into my eyes. "I'm very glad you came." The seriousness in her voice immediately erased any remaining hope that this was all a mistake. She led me into a private office away from the main lobby. The door closed behind us. A thick folder sat on her desk. I knew instantly what it contained. The documents, the lies, the beginning of whatever Brandon had been planning. Helen sat across from me and carefully opened the file. "Before I show you this," she said gently, "I need you to understand something." I nodded. "We receive admissions paperwork every week. Most are legitimate. Families are often trying to help loved ones who truly need assistance." She paused. "But this file raised concerns." My stomach dropped. "What kind of concerns?" Helen turned the folder toward me. "Several." The first document was labeled Mental Capacity Evaluation. According to the report, I suffered from significant cognitive decline, memory impairment, poor judgment, confusion, difficulty managing finances. I stared at the page. None of it was true. Not a single word. "What is this?" I whispered. Helen pointed toward the signature at the bottom. A physician had supposedly completed the evaluation. Dr. Stephen Hart. I had never met a Dr. Stephen Hart. Not once in my life. "I've never seen this doctor." "I suspected that," Helen replied. She handed me another page. This one was worse. Much worse. It contained a formal recommendation for immediate residential placement. According to the report, I was no longer capable of living independently. The recommendation urged immediate transfer into long-term supervised care. I felt physically ill. Someone hadn't merely exaggerated concerns. Someone had created an entirely fictional version of me. A helpless version. A confused version. a version that could be controlled. Then Helen slid another document across the desk. I recognized my own name immediately. At least I recognized the attempt. A signature sat near the bottom of the page. My signature. Or something pretending to be my signature. I stared at it for several seconds. The handwriting looked shaky, weak, unsteady, almost theatrical, as though someone had deliberately tried to imitate the writing of a confused elderly woman. "That's not mine." "I know." "You know." Helen nodded. "One of the reasons I called." My heart pounded. "You knew it was fake." "I strongly suspected." For the first time since entering her office, I felt something besides fear, gratitude. Someone had actually paid attention. Someone had questioned what others might have accepted without hesitation. Helen opened another section of the file. "There's more." Those two words sent a chill down my spine. More. How could there possibly be more? Then she showed me the document that truly terrified me. A power of attorney authorization. According to the paperwork, I had voluntarily granted Brandon Miller authority over major financial and legal decisions. I felt all the air leave my lungs. "No." Helen nodded grimly. That was my reaction as well. I examined the pages carefully. The signature was fake. The witnesses were unfamiliar names. The notary seal looked suspicious. Everything about it felt wrong. Yet to an overworked administrator processing paperwork, it might have appeared legitimate. If Helen had not slowed down and looked closer, the process could have moved forward. I could have been admitted. My rights could have been challenged. My finances could have fallen under Brandon's control. The realization made me dizzy. For the first time, I truly understood the danger. This wasn't about concern. This wasn't about helping me. This was about taking control of my life, my property, my future. Helen watched quietly as I absorbed the information. Finally, I looked up. "Why did you question it?" She hesitated. Then she smiled softly. "Because of Ethan." The mention of my husband's name surprised me. "You knew Ethan?" Helen nodded. "Years ago." I blinked. "What do you mean?" She leaned back slightly. "My father owned a hardware store in Columbus." I listened carefully. "Ethan used to help local business owners. He volunteered with several community projects." A memory surfaced. My husband mentoring young entrepreneurs, helping charities, supporting struggling families. That sounded exactly like him. Helen continued. "My parents never forgot his kindness." Emotion suddenly caught in my throat. Even after 8 years, hearing someone speak well of Ethan still affected me. He was a good man. He was. Helen's voice softened. "When I saw the Sanders name, I remembered him." She glanced toward the folder. "And when I reviewed these documents, something didn't feel right." "What specifically?" She pointed to several pages. "The signature." Then another document. "The inconsistent medical records." Then another. "The urgency." I frowned. "Urgency." Helen nodded. "The application specifically requested immediate placement." My pulse quickened. "Why would that matter?" "Because most families spend months discussing these decisions." I stared at her. "But Brandon wanted it done quickly." "Exactly." The room became very quiet. Helen's next words changed everything. "Vivian, I don't think this was a spontaneous decision." My heart sank. "What do you mean?" "I think someone spent considerable time preparing this. The statement landed heavily because deep down I knew she was right. This wasn't an impulsive act. It wasn't one bad choice. It was a plan, a carefully constructed plan. Every strange conversation, every missing document, every rumor about my memory, every question about my finances. They suddenly looked like preparation, steps, pieces, building blocks. Someone had been creating a false narrative for months, perhaps longer. And that someone was my grandson. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. Not because of the documents, not because of the lies, but because I finally understood something heartbreaking. Brandon hadn't betrayed me in a single moment. He had been betraying me for a very long time. Helen handed me a tissue. I wiped my eyes and took a deep breath. What do I do now? For the first time, her expression became determined. You need an attorney. I nodded slowly. I know one. And in that moment, neither of us realized that the documents in front of us were only the beginning. Because somewhere beyond Maple Grove, Brandon was already preparing the next phase of his plan, and neither of us yet understood how much he stood to gain if I disappeared into that facility. I left Maple Grove Senior Living carrying a copy of every document Helen Parker had shown me. The folder sat on the passenger seat during the entire drive home. I couldn't stop looking at it. Every red light, every stop sign, every moment my eyes drifted toward that thick stack of papers. It was amazing how a few forged signatures could completely change the way you saw someone. 24 hours earlier, Brandon had been my grandson. Now he was a stranger hiding behind familiar memories. The first call I made after arriving home was to Michael Reynolds. If there was one person Ethan had trusted completely, it was Michael. They had been friends for nearly 40 years. Michael wasn't just our attorney. He had attended family barbecues, celebrated holidays with us, helped Ethan structure our estate planning years before his death. He knew our family almost as well as we did. When I explained the situation over the phone, his voice immediately became serious. Don't discuss this with anyone. Not even Carol, I asked. A brief silence followed. Especially not Carol. His answer surprised me. At the time, I didn't understand why, but later I would. Michael asked me to bring every document to his office first thing the next morning. That night was one of the longest nights of my life. I sat in Ethan's old recliner holding one of our wedding photographs. Sometimes grief changes over the years. Sometimes it doesn't. That evening, I missed him more than I had in months. Because Ethan always knew what to do. He always saw people clearly, far more clearly than I did. I kept wondering whether he would have recognized Brandon's intentions sooner, whether he would have noticed the warning signs I ignored, whether this entire nightmare could have been prevented if he were still alive. But grief never answers those questions. It only asks them. The following morning, I arrived at Michael's office shortly after 9. He occupied the second floor of a historic brick building downtown, the same office he had used for decades. Walking through those doors felt strangely comforting, like stepping into a place where facts mattered more than emotions, where truth still had value. Michael greeted me personally. His face immediately hardened when he saw the folder in my hands. Let's take a look. For nearly 2 hours, he reviewed every page, carefully, methodically, without rushing. Occasionally, he would make notes. Other times, he simply frowned. The deeper he read, the more concerned he appeared. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. This is bad. I swallowed hard. How bad? He removed his glasses. Worse than simple forgery. My heart sank. What do you mean? Michael folded his hands together. Vivian, this isn't one fake signature. He tapped the stack of papers. This is an organized effort. The words echoed through the room. Organized effort. Not mistake. Not misunderstanding. Not confusion. An effort. A plan. Michael began separating the documents into categories. One pile contained forged signatures. Another contained suspicious medical records. A third contained questionable authorization forms. Then he pointed toward the largest pile. This is what concerns me most. I looked down. Property records, real estate information, assessment documents, home valuation reports. My stomach tightened. What about them? Michael opened one of the files. Inside was a recent property valuation, one I had never requested. Someone ordered this. Who? I don't know yet. Then he slid another paper across the desk. This one made my blood run cold. A printed email. The sender's name had been partially redacted, but the recipient was clearly visible. David Collins, a licensed real estate broker. I stared at the page. What is this? Michael pointed to the subject line. Preliminary sale discussion. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Sale. Michael nodded. The sale of your house. For several seconds I couldn't speak. The words simply refused to register. Sale of your house. My house. The home Ethan and I built together, the home Brandon grew up visiting, the home filled with decades of memories. Someone was planning to sell it, and I had never been informed. Michael continued reviewing the paperwork. The picture became clearer with every document. Someone had already gathered property details, estimated market values, potential listing information, neighborhood comparisons, projected selling prices. This wasn't a hypothetical discussion. Preparations were already underway. Michael, my voice sounded weak. Could Brandon really do this? His expression remained grim. If he successfully convinced others that you were mentally incompetent, yes. I felt sick. The plan suddenly made sense. The facility, the false medical evaluations, the forged power of attorney, the rumors about memory loss, every piece connected. Brandon didn't want me in assisted living because he was worried. He wanted me out of the way, out of the house, out of control. Then Michael revealed something even worse. Vivian, I asked one of my investigators to conduct a preliminary search this morning. I looked up. What did he find? Michael slid another document toward me. It contained public financial records, court filings, debt information. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Then I saw the numbers and gasped. Brandon owed far more money than I realized. Credit card debt, personal loans, collection notices. Several accounts had already entered default. The total exceeded 6 figures. I stared at the page. How is this possible? Michael shook his head. I don't know. But suddenly Brandon's behavior made sense. The desperation, the pressure, the constant questions about money. He wasn't simply curious. He was drowning. And drowning people sometimes grab whatever they can reach. Even family. Especially family. For a moment I found myself searching for excuses. Maybe someone manipulated him. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he felt trapped. Maybe, Michael interrupted my thoughts. Don't do that. I blinked. What? Don't start defending him. The directness surprised me. Michael rarely spoke that way, but he wasn't wrong. I had spent my entire life looking for the best in people, especially the people I loved. Perhaps that was why this happened. Perhaps Brandon counted on it. Michael opened another folder. This isn't the work of someone making one desperate mistake. He pointed toward the forged records. The fake evaluations took planning. Then the property documents. The real estate preparation took planning. Then the financial paperwork. The power of attorney documents took planning. His gaze met mine. This took months. The truth hit me harder than anything else. Months. Not one bad decision. Not one terrible afternoon. Months. Months of lies. Months of manipulation. Months of pretending to love me while secretly preparing to take control of my life. Tears filled my eyes. Not because of the money. Not because of the house. Because of the betrayal. Because every Sunday dinner, every hug, every conversation now felt contaminated. Michael gave me a few moments to compose myself. Then he spoke carefully. There is one more thing. My stomach dropped again. What now? He handed me a business card. David Collins, licensed realtor. The same name from the email. I spoke with him this morning. I stared at the card. What did he say? Michael's expression darkened. He confirmed that Brandon contacted him. The room went silent. Every remaining doubt disappeared. This was real. Brandon had actively explored selling my house before I ever stepped inside a facility, before I ever lost legal control, before I even knew what was happening. The plan wasn't coming. The plan was already moving. I looked out Michael's office window at the city below. For the first time since Helen's phone call, anger began replacing shock. Not rage, not yet, but anger. The kind that appears when grief finally meets reality. Michael closed the folder. What happens next depends on you. I turned toward him. What do you recommend? For the first time that day, a faint smile appeared. I recommend we let Brandon believe his plan is still working. A chill ran through me. What are you suggesting? Michael leaned forward. We don't stop him, I frowned. What? We watch him. The seriousness in his eyes told me everything. He wasn't preparing a defense. He was preparing a trap. And Brandon had no idea he was about to walk directly into it. For most of my life, I believed honesty was always the best path. If someone hurt you, you confronted them. If someone lied, you exposed the lie. If someone betrayed your trust, you demanded an explanation. But according to Michael Reynolds, that wasn't what we were going to do. Not yet. Instead, he wanted me to pretend. Pretend I knew nothing. Pretend Helen Parker had never called. Pretend I had never seen the forged documents. Pretend Brandon was still the loving grandson he claimed to be. The idea made me uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. I've never been good at deception, I admitted. Michael gave me a sympathetic smile. This isn't deception, Vivian. What is it then? It's self-protection. I couldn't argue with that, because if Brandon truly believed his plan was succeeding, he might reveal information we didn't yet have. And according to Michael, information was exactly what we needed. The more comfortable he feels, Michael explained, the more mistakes he'll make. I hated hearing those words, because they implied something painful. My grandson wasn't being manipulated by others. He was actively participating, making choices, creating plans, telling lies. Still, I agreed. What other option did I have? The following week felt like living inside a strange performance. Every phone call from Brandon sounded different now. Every smile looked rehearsed. Every expression seemed suspicious. Once you discover someone has been lying, it's amazing how quickly your perspective changes. Things that once appeared loving suddenly feel calculated, and that's exactly what happened. 3 days after meeting with Michael, Brandon called. "Hey, Grandma." His voice sounded cheerful, normal, as if he hadn't tried to take control of my life. "Hello, sweetheart." Even saying those words felt strange. I wasn't sure he deserved them anymore. We talked for several minutes, mostly small talk. Weather, sports, neighborhood news. Then he casually asked a question. "How have you been feeling lately?" There it was, the familiar script. "I feel fine." "You sure?" "Why wouldn't I be?" A pause followed. Then he laughed softly. "No reason." But there was a reason, and we both knew it. He just didn't realize I knew. The call ended a few minutes later. I immediately documented everything and sent notes to Michael. His response arrived less than an hour later. "Keep observing. Don't push. Let him talk." So I waited. And Brandon didn't disappoint. 2 days later, he showed up at my house unexpectedly. That used to be normal. In fact, I used to love surprise visits. Now they made my stomach tighten. I opened the door. There he stood, smiling, holding a box of pastries. The perfect grandson, or at least the version he wanted everyone to see. "Thought I'd bring your favorites." I forced a smile. "That's sweet." We sat in the kitchen drinking coffee. For nearly 20 minutes, he acted exactly like the Brandon I remembered. Funny, relaxed, charming. The contrast made everything worse, because part of me still wanted to believe this was all a misunderstanding. Then the conversation shifted. It always did. "So," Brandon said casually, "I've been thinking about what we discussed before." I pretended not to understand. "What do you mean?" "The future." I remained silent. The house. There it was. Always the house. Always the future. Always control. Never memories. Never family. Never feelings. Just assets. Just value. Just opportunity. I stirred my coffee slowly. "What about it?" Brandon leaned back in his chair. "You know, maintaining a property like this becomes difficult as people get older." The sentence sounded rehearsed, as though he had practiced it. "I manage fine. For now." I looked directly at him. "For now." He quickly smiled. "You know what I mean." Actually, I did know what he meant. Far better than he realized. The conversation continued, then something unexpected happened. Brandon became overly confident, and confidence is dangerous when you're hiding something. He started talking more freely, more casually, as if he believed the outcome was already guaranteed. "The truth is," he said, "houses become burdens eventually." I remained quiet. People spend their whole lives protecting things they don't really need anymore. I felt my jaw tighten. This wasn't about helping me. This was about convincing himself. Convincing himself that taking my home was reasonable, practical, necessary. The rationalizations of someone preparing to cross a line. Then he made a mistake. A very important mistake. "The house will only become a burden later anyway." The sentence slipped out naturally. Too naturally. I immediately recognized its significance. Because it revealed something. He wasn't discussing possibilities anymore. He was discussing assumptions. In his mind, my future had already been decided. I would leave. The house would remain, and someone else would control it. Someone else. Meaning him. I nodded thoughtfully, as though considering his advice. Inside, my heart was breaking. Brandon smiled, clearly encouraged by my reaction. Then he continued talking, and the more he talked, the more he revealed. Not directly, not enough to expose everything, but enough. Enough for Michael, enough for the investigation, enough to prove intent. After nearly an hour, Brandon finally left. The moment his car disappeared around the corner, I called Michael. I repeated every detail, every word, every observation. He listened carefully. Then he said something that surprised me. He's getting impatient. What makes you say that? The frequency. I frowned. What frequency? The visits. Michael explained that Brandon's behavior had changed significantly. The sudden increase in conversations about housing, the repeated discussions about aging, the pressure regarding future planning, all suggested urgency. Something was pushing him. Something was accelerating the timeline. Perhaps debt. Perhaps fear. Perhaps both. But one thing was becoming clear. Brandon wanted results soon, and desperate people often make careless mistakes. The following week brought another opportunity. This time Brandon arrived carrying a folder. A literal folder. The sight immediately raised alarms. He placed it on the kitchen table. I found some information. About what? Senior living options. My chest tightened. There it was. The next phase. He opened the folder and began showing me brochures, photographs, pricing sheets, facility comparisons. He spoke as though the decision had already been made, as though my role was merely agreeing. The performance was impressive. Compassionate tone, concerned expressions, carefully chosen words. Anyone observing from outside might have believed he genuinely cared. But I knew better, because I had seen the forged paperwork. I had seen the false evaluations. I had seen the plan. And suddenly, every concerned smile looked different. Every kind gesture felt artificial. Every word carried hidden motives. Then Brandon said something that nearly took my breath away. I just want what's best for you. For a brief moment, I couldn't speak. Because years earlier, he might have meant those words. Years earlier, they would have been true. Now they felt hollow, empty, a mask covering something much darker. Still I smiled. Still I nodded. Still I played my role. Because Michael was right. Brandon felt comfortable. He believed his narrative was working. He believed I remained unaware. And as long as he believed that he would continue revealing pieces of his plan, what neither of us realized was that a much bigger betrayal was quietly waiting in the shadows, because Brandon wasn't the only person involved. And before long, I was about to discover that someone even closer to me had helped make this entire scheme possible. About 10 days after Brandon brought the senior living brochures to my house, he called with what sounded like an innocent invitation. Grandma, we're having a family dinner on Saturday. I immediately felt uneasy. Brandon rarely organized family gatherings. In fact, he usually avoided them. What are we celebrating? I asked. A brief pause followed. Then he laughed. Nothing, just family. The answer sounded rehearsed. Almost too casual. I thanked him and said I would be there. The moment the call ended, I contacted Michael Reynolds. His response was immediate. Go. You think it's connected. I'd bet money on it. By then, both of us had learned something important. Brandon was becoming increasingly bold. The pressure he felt was pushing him to move faster, and fast-moving plans often create opportunities. So Saturday evening arrived. For the first time in my life, I felt nervous about attending a family dinner. As I drove to Brandon's house, a strange sadness settled over me. Families are supposed to be safe places. They are supposed to be where you feel protected. Instead, I felt like I was walking into enemy territory. Michael had prepared me carefully. Listen more than you speak. Don't argue. Don't reveal anything. Observe. So that's exactly what I planned to do. When I arrived, several cars were already parked outside. More people than I expected. My uneasiness grew. Inside, I found Brandon greeting guests near the front door. His smile appeared instantly. "Grandma." He hugged me warmly. Too warmly. The performance was becoming easier to recognize. I returned the hug anyway. The house was full. A few cousins, an uncle, several extended family members, and my daughter Carol. The moment I saw her, something inside me tightened. I couldn't explain why. Not yet. Perhaps because Michael's warning still echoed in my mind, especially not Carol. At the time, I still didn't understand what he meant. But I would soon. Dinner began normally enough. People talked about sports, politics, vacation plans, work, the usual family topics. For a while, I almost convinced myself I had imagined everything. Maybe Michael was wrong. Maybe Brandon simply wanted family together. Maybe. Then the conversation shifted, almost seamlessly, as though everyone had rehearsed it beforehand. One of my cousins smiled politely. "Vivian, how have you been feeling lately?" The question immediately caught my attention. "Fine." Another relative nodded. "That's wonderful." Then Carol spoke. "You've seemed tired recently." I looked at her. "Tired?" "A little." The room grew quieter. Almost everyone appeared interested in my answer. And suddenly, I understood. This wasn't random. This wasn't natural. The dinner had a purpose. Brandon leaned forward. "We all worry about you, Grandma." There it was again, the script, the same narrative, the same carefully constructed story, concern, worry, protection, words that sounded loving while hiding something ugly underneath. I forced a small smile. "That's kind." Carol nodded. "We just want what's best for you." The sentence made my stomach turn, because it was identical to what Brandon kept saying. Exactly identical. I began studying the faces around the table. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked confused. A few seemed genuinely concerned, which meant Brandon had been talking. A lot. The campaign to portray me as vulnerable had spread far beyond private conversations. He had been building support, building witnesses, building credibility. The realization hurt more than I expected. For months, maybe longer, people had been hearing stories about my supposed decline, stories I knew nothing about. Then Brandon made his move. "You know, we've discussed senior living communities before." The room became silent. I slowly placed my fork on the table. "Have we?" His smile never wavered. "A few times." Interesting. He wanted everyone to believe I had already considered it. Another layer of preparation. Another carefully planted idea. "They can be wonderful places," Carol added. The moment she spoke, several pieces began fitting together. Not proof, not yet. But something felt wrong. Very wrong. Why was Carol supporting this so enthusiastically? Why did she seem completely comfortable discussing my future as though I wasn't sitting there? And why did Brandon keep glancing toward her after making certain comments, almost as if they shared an understanding? A silent communication, an alliance. The thought unsettled me deeply. For the next 30 minutes, the conversation continued. Not aggressively, not openly, which made it worse. Everything was wrapped in kindness, concern, sympathy, yet beneath the surface I could feel the pressure. Subtle, persistent, coordinated. Eventually, Brandon stood and addressed the room. "Grandma has always taken care of everyone." Several people nodded. "Maybe it's time we help take care of her." The statement earned supportive murmurs. I felt my chest tighten. There it was, the hero narrative. Brandon wasn't positioning himself as a beneficiary. He was positioning himself as a savior, a devoted grandson sacrificing for his elderly grandmother, a role he seemed eager to play. Then something unexpected happened. One of my cousins asked a question. "Vivian, what do you think?" The entire room looked toward me. For a moment, nobody spoke. This was the moment Brandon expected, the moment he thought I would resist emotionally, perhaps appear confused, perhaps look unstable, perhaps reinforce the image he had spent months creating. Instead, I smiled calmly. "I think it's wonderful that everyone cares." Several faces relaxed, including Brandon's. He clearly interpreted my response as surrender. Encouraged, he continued, "We've even researched some excellent facilities." Again, with the facilities. Again, with the preparation. Again, with the assumption that decisions about my life belong to everyone except me. Yet I remained calm, because Michael had instructed me to wait. And because outside parked several houses away, Michael himself was waiting, with documents, with evidence, with truths that nobody inside that dining room knew existed. The irony was almost painful. Everyone around the table seemed to believe I was powerless, a fragile old woman being guided toward the next stage of life. In reality, I knew more than any of them realized. I knew about the forged signatures. I knew about the false evaluations. I knew about the power of attorney documents. I knew about the real estate plans. And most importantly, I knew Brandon was lying. Still remaining silent wasn't easy. Every smile felt like a betrayal. Every sympathetic glance felt insulting. Every conversation reminded me how completely Brandon had manipulated the people around him. Or perhaps not all of them. Because as the evening continued, I began noticing something troubling. Carol wasn't acting surprised by any of this. Not once. She didn't question Brandon. She didn't hesitate. She didn't challenge his assumptions. Instead, she reinforced them. Repeatedly. Almost automatically, and for the first time a terrifying possibility entered my mind. What if Brandon wasn't acting alone? The thought arrived quietly, but once it appeared, it refused to leave. I watched Carol across the table, watched the way she exchanged looks with Brandon, watched the ease with which she supported his narrative, and suddenly Michael's warning echoed inside my head again. Especially not Carol. By the time dessert arrived, I no longer believed that warning had been random. Something was wrong, something bigger than Brandon, something hidden. And before long, the truth would emerge, a truth far more painful than anything I had discovered so far, because the next betrayal wasn't coming from my grandson. It was coming from my daughter. The moment finally came 3 days after the family dinner. Michael called me early that morning. "I think we're ready." My stomach tightened immediately. For weeks, we had been gathering evidence. watching, waiting, allowing Brandon to believe his plan was unfolding exactly as intended. Now it was time to stop waiting. "What happens next?" I asked. Michael's voice remained calm. "You tell the truth." It sounded simple, but it wasn't. Because the truth would destroy relationships. The truth would expose lies. The truth would force people to choose sides. And most painfully of all, the truth would reveal exactly who Brandon had become. That evening, Brandon hosted another gathering, smaller this time. Just close family. Carol was there. A few relatives. Several people who had attended the previous dinner. Brandon greeted everyone with the same polished smile he always wore. The smile of a devoted grandson. The smile of a man pretending to be concerned. The smile that had fooled so many people, including me, for far too long. As dinner progressed, I noticed Brandon growing increasingly confident. He seemed relaxed, comfortable, almost victorious. The reason was obvious. He believed I was surrendering. He believed the pressure campaign was working. He believed I was slowly accepting the future he had chosen for me. What he didn't know was that Michael Reynolds was sitting in a car 2 houses away, waiting for my signal. Dessert had just been served when Brandon casually returned to the familiar topic. "Grandma," he said gently, "I've been thinking about Maple Grove again." Several family members nodded. Carol looked down at her plate. Something about that bothered me. Then Brandon continued. "They have an opening available soon." Soon. Not eventually, not someday. Soon. His eagerness was becoming difficult to hide. I took a slow breath. For the first time all evening I interrupted him. "That's interesting." He smiled. "I thought so too." The room grew quiet. Everyone sensed something changing. I placed my fork down carefully. Then I looked directly at Brandon. "When exactly were you planning to tell me?" His smile faltered. "Tell you what?" "The part where you already submitted admission paperwork." Silence. Complete silence. The air seemed to disappear from the room. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even blinked. Brandon stared at me, his face drained of color. "What?" "You heard me." My voice remained calm, steady, controlled, far calmer than I actually felt. "When were you planning to tell me that paperwork had already been submitted in my name?" Several relatives looked confused. Others looked shocked. Carol suddenly appeared terrified. Brandon forced a nervous laugh. "I don't know what you're talking about." There it was. The first lie. The desperate lie. The predictable lie. I had expected it. In fact, Michael had practically guaranteed it. So I wasn't surprised. Instead, I reached into my purse and removed a copy of the admission documents. The room became so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. I slid the papers across the table, straight toward Brandon. His eyes widened immediately. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw genuine fear. Not concern, not confusion. Fear. "Where did you get those?" The question came out before he could stop himself. A mistake. A very important mistake. Because innocent people don't ask where forged documents came from. They ask what documents. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Brandon realized his error instantly. But it was too late. I watched panic begin creeping across his face. Then I asked the question that mattered most. "Would you like to explain why my signature appears on documents I never signed?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Brandon shook his head. "This is a misunderstanding." Another lie. Predictable. Weak. Desperate. I opened the folder again. "Then perhaps you can explain the power of attorney paperwork." More silence. "Or the false medical evaluation." His eyes darted toward Carol. The movement lasted less than a second. But I noticed. And so did several other people. Then Brandon stood abruptly. "Grandma, somebody is manipulating you." I almost laughed. The irony was overwhelming. Manipulating me. The man who spent months trying to steal my independence was accusing someone else of manipulation. Before he could continue, I reached for my phone. "Actually," I said calmly, "I'd like everyone to hear something." I pressed play. The recording began. Brandon's voice filled the dining room. Clear. Undeniable. "The house will only become a burden later anyway." The room froze. Then another section played. More comments about the property, more comments about the future, more comments revealing assumptions he shouldn't have been making. Nobody spoke. The recording ended. Several relatives stared at Brandon. Others looked horrified. One cousin quietly whispered, "Oh my God." Still, Brandon tried to recover. "You recorded me. I protected myself." His face darkened, and for the first time the mask slipped completely. The caring grandson disappeared. The charming grandson disappeared. The concerned grandson disappeared. What remained was anger, raw anger, because his plan was collapsing. Then came the moment Michael had been waiting for. I looked toward the front door and nodded. A few seconds later, it opened. Michael Reynolds entered carrying a large briefcase. The room erupted into confusion. "What's going on? Why is he here?" "Vivian." Michael calmly approached the table. Then he began placing documents in front of everyone. One by one, the forged admission paperwork, the fraudulent authorization forms, the fake medical records, the property valuation reports, the emails, the evidence. Years of legal experience had taught Michael how to present facts, and facts are powerful things, especially when liars run out of excuses. Brandon's confidence vanished completely. As each document appeared, his expression worsened. Then Michael produced the final piece, an email exchange involving real estate broker David Collins, several pages long, printed directly from business records. The subject line alone told the story, "Preparing property for sale." The room exploded. "What is this?" "You were trying to sell her house." "You said you were helping her." Questions came from every direction. Brandon couldn't answer fast enough, because there were no answers, only lies. And lies don't survive evidence very well. Then the front door opened again. Everyone turned. David Collins stepped inside. Michael had arranged everything. The timing, the documents, the witness. All of it. David looked uncomfortable, but determined. When Michael asked whether Brandon had contacted him regarding the possible sale of my property, David answered immediately. "Yes." The single word landed like a bomb. No more denial. No more confusion. No more pretending. The truth stood fully exposed. Brandon lowered his head. For the first time all evening, he stopped talking. Stopped arguing, stopped performing, because he finally understood. The game was over. Yet as devastating as that moment was, an even greater shock was still waiting. Because throughout the entire confrontation, one person had remained strangely silent. Carol, my daughter. Brandon's mother. And as I looked across the table at her trembling hands, I realized something terrifying. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't learning this information for the first time. She already knew, and that realization hurt more than every forged document combined. I wish I could tell you that exposing Brandon's lies was the most painful moment of this entire ordeal. It wasn't, not even close. Because while betrayal from a grandchild is devastating, betrayal from your own child reaches somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to heal. The dining room remained silent after the evidence was presented. No one seemed to know what to say. Brandon sat motionless. The confident man who had spent months controlling the narrative had completely disappeared. Several relatives stared at him in disbelief. Others looked angry. A few simply looked heartbroken. But my attention wasn't on Brandon anymore. It was on Carol, my daughter, the woman I had raised, the woman I had sacrificed for, the woman who couldn't meet my eyes. And that frightened me more than anything else, because innocent people usually defend themselves. Carol wasn't defending herself. She was hiding. Michael noticed it too. I could tell from the way he watched her, patiently, carefully, like a man waiting for the final piece of a puzzle. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, controlled, professional. "Carol, would you like to explain your involvement?" The room froze. Several relatives looked confused. "Involvement?" one cousin asked. Carol's face immediately lost color. There it was. The reaction of someone who already knows the answer. My heart began pounding. "No." The word escaped my lips before I could stop it. I wasn't speaking to Michael. I was speaking to reality itself. No, not Carol. Not my daughter. Not my little girl. Not the child whose hand I held on her first day of school. Not the teenager who cried in my arms after her first heartbreak. Not the woman Ethan loved so fiercely. No, anyone but her. Michael opened another folder, a folder I hadn't seen before, and suddenly I understood why he had insisted I trust the process. Because while I had been focusing on Brandon, he had continued investigating, digging deeper, following every lead, looking for everyone involved, and what he found broke my heart. "Several weeks ago," Michael began, "my office obtained records related to the forged paperwork." Carol closed her eyes. That single movement told me everything. She already knew what was coming. Michael continued. "Those records revealed that Brandon did not obtain certain personal documents on his own. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The room seemed suspended in time. Then Michael placed several copies on the table. Phone records, email records, document requests, financial records, evidence. Cold, precise, unemotional evidence. The kind that destroys lies. One piece at a time. My eyes moved across the pages. Then I saw Carol's name. Once, twice, again, and again. My stomach twisted. "No." Michael's voice remained steady. "Carol provided access to family records." The words hit like a physical blow. I looked at my daughter. She still couldn't look at me. "Tell me he's wrong." Nothing. "Carol." Still nothing. My voice cracked. "Look at me." Slowly, tears filled her eyes, but she remained silent, and silence can be more devastating than any confession, because silence often confirms the truth before words ever arrive. I felt my chest tightening, my hands trembling, not from anger, from grief. because deep down I already knew. Then Michael revealed the next piece. Several personal documents used during the forgery process originated from materials stored in Carol's possession. The room erupted. What? Oh my God. Carol! People stared at her in disbelief, but I barely heard them. All I could hear was the sound of my own heart breaking. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The family dinner, the repeated support, the coordinated conversations, the pressure, the identical talking points, the way Brandon always seemed to know things he shouldn't know. He wasn't acting alone. He had help, and that help came from my daughter. Finally, Carol began crying. Real crying. Not the careful tears people perform, the ugly kind, the desperate kind, the kind that appears when there are no more lies left. I'm sorry. The words barely emerged. I stared at her, unable to process them. Sorry. Sorry. How could that possibly be enough? Michael remained silent, allowing her to speak, allowing the truth to surface naturally, and eventually it did, one painful piece at a time. My business was failing. Carol's voice shook. I didn't know what to do. Nobody interrupted. The room listened. My loans were overdue. More tears. I couldn't make payroll. She lowered her head. I thought I was going to lose everything. For a brief moment, sympathy flickered inside me. Because financial desperation is real. Fear is real. Failure is painful. Then she continued, and the sympathy disappeared. Brandon came to me with a plan. A plan. Not an accident. Not a mistake. A plan. My eyes closed, because hearing it aloud somehow hurt more. He said Grandma had enough money. I felt physically ill. He said the house would solve everything. The house. Always the house. Not memories, not family, not Ethan, not me. The house, an asset, a solution, a transaction. I opened my eyes again, and suddenly I no longer recognized my own daughter. Carol continued speaking, sometimes crying, sometimes struggling to breathe. But the truth kept coming. At first, she claimed she only shared documents. Then she admitted she knew about the facility. Then she admitted she knew about the attempt to gain control. Each confession revealed a little more, a little worse, a little deeper, until finally the entire room understood. Carol had not forged my signature. That part was Brandon's responsibility. Carol had not created the fake evaluations. Again, Brandon. But she had helped, enabled, supported, facilitated. She had provided access, information, documents, and most importantly, silence. The silence that allowed everything else to happen. One relative shook his head in disbelief. Another quietly left the room. Someone else began crying. But none of it compared to what I felt, because this wasn't just betrayal. It was abandonment. A mother spends her life protecting her children. You expect many things in return: respect, honesty, love. But you never expect them to view you as an obstacle, a problem, a source of funding. Yet that was exactly what had happened. At some point somewhere along the way, Carol stopped seeing me as her mother and started seeing me as a solution. The realization devastated me. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Carol finally looked directly at me. The first time all evening. The first time since everything began. And what I saw wasn't evil. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't cruelty. It was weakness, cowardice, regret. The regret of someone who crossed a line and couldn't find her way back. "I'm sorry, Mom." The words echoed through the room. I wanted to forgive her. Part of me always would, because mothers don't stop loving their children, even when those children break their hearts. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, and in that moment I realized something painful. My trust was gone, perhaps forever. Then Michael quietly closed his folder. The investigation was complete. The truth had finally surfaced. Brandon had built the scheme. Carol had helped make it possible. And now both of them would have to face consequences. The only question remaining was what those consequences would be. And that decision was coming sooner than either of them expected. The hardest decisions in life are rarely about right and wrong. They're about choosing between two painful truths. That was exactly where I found myself after the confrontation. On one side stood my family, my daughter, my grandson, the people I had loved for decades. On the other side stood justice, accountability, self-respect, protection. For several days after everything came to light, I barely left my house. The silence felt different now. Not peaceful, heavy. Every room contained memories. And now those memories were tangled together with betrayal. I spent hours sitting in Ethan's old chair, staring through the living room window, thinking, remembering, questioning. The same question returned again and again. How do you hold people accountable when those people share your blood I didn't know? Part of me wanted to pretend none of it had happened, to forgive everyone, to avoid conflict, to preserve whatever remained of the family. But another part of me understood something important. Ignoring wrongdoing does not create peace. It only creates permission. And permission was exactly what had allowed this situation to grow so dangerous. 3 days later, Michael Reynolds arrived at my house. He carried another folder. This one looked even thicker than the last. I already knew what it contained. The next steps, the consequences, the reality nobody wanted to face. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Brandon had eaten hundreds of meals over the years, the same table where Ethan and I once planned family vacations. Now it had become the place where legal strategies were discussed. Life can change so quickly. Michael opened the folder. "The evidence is substantial." I nodded. "I know. The authorities will likely take this seriously." That wasn't surprising. Forgery, fraudulent documents, attempted financial exploitation, false medical claims. None of those accusations were minor, especially when an elderly person was involved. Michael continued, "There are several options." I listened carefully. Some involved civil proceedings. Others involved formal complaints to state agencies. Several included potential criminal investigations. Each option carried consequences. Real consequences. For Brandon, for Carol, for everyone involved. I stared at the paperwork. Then I asked the question that had haunted me for days. What would Ethan do? Michael smiled sadly. I've asked myself that too. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he answered, "He would protect you." The words hit harder than I expected, because deep down I knew he was right. Ethan had always been compassionate, but he was never weak. He believed in forgiveness, yet he also believed in responsibility. Those two things are not opposites. Many people think they are. They're not. You can forgive someone and still require accountability. You can love someone and still refuse to let them hurt you. It took me 72 years to fully understand that lesson. And now, I finally did. The following week, Michael formally submitted documentation to the appropriate authorities. The process moved surprisingly quickly, partly because the evidence was overwhelming, partly because elder financial abuse cases had become a growing concern. Investigators reviewed the forged signatures, examined the fake evaluations, analyzed the financial records, verified the property-related communications. Everything pointed in the same direction: the truth. Brandon soon learned that the situation was no longer under his control. The phone calls began almost immediately. At first he called repeatedly, then he texted, then he left voice messages. Most went unanswered. I simply wasn't ready. Not yet. One message, however, stood out. "Grandma, please talk to me." I listened to it several times. His voice sounded different. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the manipulation. Gone was the performance. For the first time, he sounded frightened. And perhaps he was. But fear alone doesn't erase consequences. Several days later, Carol came to see me. Alone. I almost didn't open the door, but eventually I did. The moment she stepped inside, I saw how much she had changed. She looked exhausted, defeated, older somehow. Guilt has a way of aging people. We sat in the living room. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she started crying. Again. Not dramatically, not theatrically, quietly. The tears of someone who finally understands what they've lost. "I never wanted this." The words emerged softly. I looked at her. "Then why did you allow it?" That question mattered more than any apology, because understanding doesn't excuse behavior, but it helps explain it. Carol stared at the floor. "I was scared." The answer sounded painfully honest. "My business was failing." "I know." "I thought everything I'd built was collapsing." I nodded. "I know." More tears. "But fear doesn't justify what you did." She closed her eyes. No, it doesn't." For the first time since this nightmare began, she stopped making excuses. That mattered. Not because it fixed anything, because it didn't, but because truth matters, especially after months of lies. We talked for nearly 2 hours. About money, about mistakes, about Brandon, about family, about Ethan, about regret. The conversation was painful, but necessary. Before leaving, Carol looked directly at me. "Are you ever going to forgive me?" I thought carefully before answering. Because forgiveness is often misunderstood. People treat it like a switch, something that turns on instantly. It doesn't work that way. Trust is built slowly. Forgiveness is earned slowly. Healing happens slowly. I don't know yet. The answer made her cry again, but it was honest, and honesty was long overdue. Meanwhile, Brandon's situation continued deteriorating. Investigators interviewed him, reviewed evidence, examined records. Every attempt to explain away the documents collapsed under scrutiny. Because facts don't care about explanations. Facts simply exist. Eventually, Michael received updates regarding the case. Nothing dramatic, nothing sensational, just reality. The process was moving forward. Consequences were coming. And for the first time in months, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not happiness. Relief. Because the burden was no longer mine alone. For months I had carried confusion, fear, doubt, betrayal. Now the truth existed in the open, visible, documented, acknowledged. No more pretending, no more manipulation, no more secret plans. One evening, about a month after the confrontation, I sat on my back porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange and gold, the same way it had thousands of times before. Yet somehow everything felt different, stronger, clearer. I realized something important that night. Taking legal action wasn't an act of revenge. For a while, I worried it might be. I worried people would think I was punishing my family, but that wasn't true. Revenge seeks suffering. I wasn't seeking suffering. I was seeking protection. Protection for myself. Protection for other elderly people who might someday face similar situations. Protection against the dangerous idea that family members can exploit trust without consequences. That distinction mattered a great deal. As darkness settled across the yard, I thought about the months ahead. The legal process, the healing process, the rebuilding process. None of it would be easy. But for the first time since Helen Parker's phone call, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. Not complete peace. Not yet. But the beginning of it. And sometimes beginnings are enough. What I didn't know then was that my greatest chapter still lay ahead. Not the chapter about betrayal. Not the chapter about justice. The chapter about healing. The chapter where I would finally learn that surviving heartbreak is only half the journey. The other half is learning how to live again afterward. People often think healing begins the moment justice is served. In my experience, that's not true. Justice creates safety. Healing comes afterward, quietly, slowly, one ordinary day at a time. About 6 months after Helen Parker made that life-changing phone call, I found myself standing in my garden on a cool spring morning. The roses were blooming. The same roses Ethan had planted years ago. The same roses Brandon used to help me water when he was a little boy. For the first time in a long while, those memories no longer hurt quite as much. They still hurt. But they no longer controlled me. And that difference mattered. The legal matters had largely been resolved. Michael Reynolds had helped ensure that every important safeguard was now in place. My estate documents had been completely updated. My financial accounts had additional protections. Access permissions had been reviewed and secured. Every vulnerable area had been strengthened, not because I expected another attack, but because I had learned a painful lesson. Trust should never replace preparation, especially as we grow older. One afternoon, Michael and I met for lunch. As we reviewed the final paperwork, he smiled. "You've done remarkably well." I laughed softly. There were days when I didn't think I would. He nodded. "That's normal." Then he looked at me carefully. "But you're stronger than you realize." The strange thing was that I finally believed him. Not because I had won, not because Brandon's plan had failed, but because I had survived something I never imagined surviving. The betrayal of people I loved. And somehow, I was still standing. That realization changed me. Over the following months, I made several decisions that would have surprised the old version of me. First, I changed the locks. That sounds simple, almost insignificant. But it wasn't. For me, it represented something important. The right to feel safe in my own home again. The right to establish boundaries. The right to protect my peace. Then I hired a financial advisor recommended by Michael. Together, we reviewed every account, every document, every long-term plan. Not because I was afraid, because I was being responsible. There is a difference. Fear hides. Responsibility prepares. And after everything that had happened, I intended to be prepared. Another unexpected change came through Helen Parker. The woman whose phone call had started this entire journey remained in my life. At first, we met occasionally for coffee, then more frequently. Eventually, a genuine friendship developed. Funny how life works. Sometimes the person who saves you begins as a stranger. One afternoon, Helen invited me to speak at a community meeting. The topic was elder financial abuse. My first instinct was to decline. I wasn't a public speaker. I wasn't an expert. I was simply a woman whose family had betrayed her. But Helen convinced me, "You have something valuable to share." I wasn't sure she was right. Still, I agreed. The meeting changed everything. As I stood before that small audience and told my story, I noticed something surprising. People weren't shocked. They were recognizing pieces of their own lives. Afterward, several older adults approached me. One woman admitted her son had pressured her to transfer property. Another described suspicious activity involving bank accounts. A retired teacher revealed concerns about a nephew constantly asking about inheritance. The stories were different, yet the themes felt familiar. Trust, pressure, manipulation, fear. That night I realized something. My experience wasn't unique. Far too many older adults suffer in silence. Far too many people are afraid to speak up because the person hurting them shares their last name. That realization gave my pain purpose, and purpose is a powerful thing. Over time, I began volunteering with local organizations focused on elder advocacy. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, just conversations, education, support, listening, helping others recognize warning signs before situations escalated. Each person I met reinforced the same lesson. Growing older does not mean surrendering your dignity. It does not mean giving away your voice. And it certainly does not mean accepting mistreatment, no matter who is responsible. As for Carol, our relationship changed forever. Some wounds never completely disappear, but they can heal enough to stop bleeding. We spoke occasionally, slowly, carefully, honestly, for perhaps the first time in our lives. Trust was not restored overnight. In truth, it still isn't fully restored. Perhaps it never will be. But healing doesn't always require things to return to their previous form. Sometimes healing means creating something new, something more honest, something built on reality instead of assumptions. Carol eventually closed her failing business. She sought counseling. She began rebuilding her life. Not because I rescued her, because she finally accepted responsibility for her choices, and that mattered. Brandon's path proved more complicated. We had very limited contact, mostly through letters at first, occasionally through brief conversations later. The anger gradually faded. The disappointment remained. But even disappointment changes over time. I no longer spent my days asking why. I no longer replayed every betrayal. I no longer searched for explanations. Instead, I focused on the future, my future. Because despite everything that happened, I was still alive, still healthy, still capable, still free. One evening, nearly a year after Helen's phone call, I sat alone on my back porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange, gold, and purple. Beautiful, peaceful, familiar. I thought about Ethan. I often do, and for the first time I imagined what he might say about everything that happened. Not the legal battle, not the betrayal, not the consequences, the recovery, the resilience, the choice to keep living. I think he would be proud. Not because I fought back, because I refused to let bitterness define the rest of my life. That may have been the greatest victory of all. The people who tried to take my independence failed. The people who tried to control my future failed. And perhaps most importantly, the betrayal itself failed, because it did not destroy me. It changed me. It strengthened me. But it did not destroy me. As darkness settled across the garden, I looked at the roses swaying gently in the evening breeze. Then I smiled. Not because life was perfect. Not because everything had been repaired, because I finally understood something simple and powerful. Love does not require surrender. Forgiveness does not require weakness. And growing older does not mean giving anyone permission to decide your worth. My name is Vivian Sanders. This is my story, and thankfully, it is not the end. Life has a way of teaching us lessons we never expected to learn. Sometimes those lessons come through joy. Other times they arrive through heartbreak. What happened to me taught me that trust is precious, but it should never replace wisdom. Loving your family does not mean ignoring warning signs. Offering forgiveness does not mean accepting continued harm. And growing older does not mean giving up your right to make decisions about your own life. If there is one message I hope you take from my story, it is this. Your age does not diminish your value, your voice, or your dignity. No matter how old you are, you deserve respect. You deserve honesty, and you deserve to be surrounded by people who protect you rather than take advantage of you. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is set boundaries even with the people we love most. That isn't cruelty, it's self-respect. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in my position? Could you forgive a family member after a betrayal like this? Share your opinion in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our community. Also tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I read as many comments as I can, and I'd love to hear your story too.